So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our web talk, Nordic by Natures, How the Nordics Shaped the Alliance. I'm Patrick Waltz, Head of State Office Hessen and Rhineland-Palatinate of the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation for Freedom. And I'd also like to use the opportunity to greet you on behalf of Frank Blechschmidt, the chairman of our associated Karl Hermann Flach Foundation. Last week, the Vilnius NATO summit was concluded, and among the results, even when announced before the actual summit itself, was that Turkey would no longer obstruct Swedish membership into NATO. Finland had already been admitted, so I thought this might be a good opportunity to have a look at how NATO will look like in the future, how the accession of these Nordic states to the alliance will alter the alliance itself, what will they bring into the alliance, and what will change in points of view of geography, of capabilities, but also mentality. And I'm glad that I don't have to answer all these questions myself, but I have an expert panel at my disposal, and I'd like to introduce them to you. First, we have Dr. Iro Särkkä from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And as luck would have it, she has specialized on Finnish foreign and security policy in the post-Cold War era with a focus on Russia. So I think this fits really well. And Dr. Särkkä, I'm glad to have you on board to, well, explain a little bit more about the Finnish look on NATO, on Russia, and on security this evening to our audience. Great to have you with us. And I'd also like to introduce Tony Lawrence. He's from the Estonian International Center for Defense and Security. He started out his life, as I read, as civil servant in the UK in the security department, but has been now for more than 15 years been working for the ICDS in Estonia, and has a strong focus, of course, on the Baltic area. And as the Baltics are, well, supposedly those who will profit most, hopefully, from the Nordic new member states, I'm also interested to listen to his Baltic view. And I must admit, I'm a big fan of ICDS. They have great dossiers. So if you want to read interesting analysis, head to them. I'm always astonished because Estonia has less than 2 million inhabitants, I guess. And so this is really, well, impressive. It's always like comparing to Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. If I think how competent would Mecklenburg-Vorpommern be when analyzing Russia, it's humiliating. And finally, we have my colleague Jeroen Dobber from the Security Hub in Brussels. He's the head of the Security Hub, and he has also followed the events in Vilnius. And he'll, of course, give his opinion through a liberal lens. And I'm interested to hear your opinion of the Vilnius summit. And all of this will be hosted by Dr. Markus Pindur from, sorry, this is my my son who's just barged in. I have, yes. 1 second, I will be back. Please excuse that, but I hope since Corona, this isn't as unusual as it used to be. Anyway, Marcus will be, well, holding all the, will be the one steering the discussion and pointing the panel in the direction to share their expertise with us. And before handing over, I'd like to say there's another, this is today another important day because exactly 9 years ago, nearly 300 people were blown out of the sky when MH17 was shot down. And I think this was when the war arrived in Western Europe. Even if we weren't directly at the front lines 9 years ago, this was when European citizens died. And the this was one event which pushed me into civic education, because the ensuing disinformation campaign was simply shameful. And even more shameful was the fact that many people were willing to believe the lies, even though it went completely against logic and anything. So in fact, this war has been going on for 9 years, at least, has taken already civilian toll or civilian casualties from Western Europe. And today, if you have a few moments to spare, well, think of those 300 people who were minding their business when they suddenly were killed. And this is when Russia's war arrived in Europe. So how can we make Europe safe in the future? How can we make European skies safe? And what can the Nordic states contribute to all that? This is the topic for this evening. I'm very thrilled to listen to our panel. And Marcus, please start off the session.
Hello, everybody. I hope you'll have an informative and wonderful time with us here at the Friedrich-Naumann Foundation. A French president famously said a couple of years ago that NATO to him was brain dead. It was stupid to say something like that at the time, but right now, the events showed that NATO is not brain dead. It seems to be alive and kicking. The Russian aggression was a wake-up call to NATO and its members, and it changed the political map of Europe. Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO. The addition of a new member to NATO is always welcomed and appreciated, especially so in this case that Sweden now can become the 32nd member state of NATO. That is good news to NATO. And I guess it is good news to Finland too. Dr. Särkkä, is that right? And could you describe what that means to Finland now?
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me to this lovely seminar this afternoon. I'm coming from the colors of Nordic light and Nordic noir, one could say, and we're also very happy here in Finland because now Sweden finally got an invitation. Got an invitation a year ago already, but Turkey accepted as well. I mean, for Finland, this is a huge deal. And like our President Sauli Niinistö said a few months ago, I mean, Finland's NATO membership is not complete before we have Sweden in the alliance as well. We started this journey together. Our paths kind of departed at some point early on this winter, but here we are. It's a great relief here in Helsinki that finally Sweden has been given green light as well. Basically, I would say 3 things that will change in the Northern Europe or in NATO once Sweden will join as well. First of all, there are no limits for cooperation between the different Nordic countries and the allied members as well. So, I mean, I think this is something that the Nordic countries have really been waiting for over 15 years since the inception of NORDEFCO, which is the regional framework for cooperation. I mean, until last spring, you know, there were really limits up to which cooperation could be reinforced, and now there are no limits anymore. So this is a big deal for the Nordic countries, but also for Finland and Sweden, because Finland and Sweden we are the closest partners, analyzed and been already since, you know, the NATO membership now. And it means that we can go as deep as we want to go. And obviously we have to accept the fact at the same time that we are willing to deepen the cooperation with other NATO allies. So I think there are great opportunities for regional formats of cooperation as well, with the Baltic countries as well. Second of all, we have to look at the map, and just by looking at it, we can see that there will be new, new geopolitical realities emerging from this enlargement. Basically, the Baltic Sea, you know, that will open up so many different things for all the NATO allies. I mean, NATO's deterrence and defense will improve tremendously when Finland and Sweden will join the alliance. And I think the Baltic countries are particularly happy about that. Also, I think Finland and Sweden will be great contributors to NATO's peacetime operations. So I think now we're going to the capability side, which is the third factor I'd like to bring in. in this introductory remark, is that I think Finland and Sweden are likely to contribute to NATO's air policing in the Baltic countries, for instance. So this is just one of the many capabilities that Finland and Sweden will bring in, because the two countries are really very interoperable when it comes to capabilities, also in terms of ways of operating. I mean, we've been participant in NATO's operations, also in the out-of-area operations for many, many years. So I think in totality, or in summary, one could say that both Finland and Sweden will contribute tremendously as security providers to NATO once Sweden's membership will be fully completed, hopefully already by the early autumn. Thank you. That's my introductory remark.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Särkkä. Tony Lawrence, why is the accession of Finland and Sweden so important for the Baltic states?
Thanks, Marcus, and thank you also to the Foundation for the opportunity to be here this evening. It's a great privilege. Why it's important? Very simply because when Finland and Sweden join NATO, the entire geostrategic picture in the Nordic Baltic region changes, and it changes to the benefit of the Baltic states in terms of their security situation and the prospects for their defence. I have very sort of similar things to say to what Iro has just said, but I'm just going to talk briefly about the benefits at the political, at the operational, at the tactical levels. So at the political level, we now have an entire block of states that are all members of the same institutions, with the exception of Norway, of course, not being in the EU. But states that all think broadly similarly. These are all states that recognise the threat from Russia. They're all states that see the importance of a military component as part of the response to that threat. And they're now all states that will organise that military component under NATO. And that's essentially been Baltic security thinking since the early 1990s. Within the alliance itself, Finland and Sweden's membership shifts the alliance centre of gravity up to the north and to the east. It bolsters the voices who see the threat from Russia and see that collective defence on the northeast flank ought to be NATO's primary focus. And it adds to the voices that welcome transatlantic dimension or US engagement in European security as well. And again, these have been long-standing Baltic positions, so it shouldn't be a surprise that the Baltic states very much welcome Finland and Sweden's membership. At the operational level, accession means that basically the entirety of Northern and Eastern Europe is now a single operational space, or a series of connected spaces, all the way from the Atlantic in the east to the Baltic in the west, from the Arctic in the north and right the way down to the Black Sea in the south. And from a Baltic perspective, that means we're no longer so geographically isolated as we have been during the time we've been members of the alliance. What that new geography does is give NATO commanders many more options for preparing for and for responding to threats. So options for reinforcement routes, options for basing of air and sea assets, options for pre-positioning equipment and supplies, and also for conducting defensive operations. It means that anyone thinking of attacking NATO in this region will now have a much more complicated strategic calculation to make, and that just means stronger deterrence for all of us. At the tactical level, Finland and Sweden are going to bring modern, well-equipped armed forces to the alliance, and particularly important is the contribution that they'll make in the air and on the sea, where the Baltic capabilities are rather thin at the moment. So undoubtedly, this is all a good thing. I thought I might just add a couple of words about strategic culture, because I mean, Germany, and I guess we're speaking largely to a German audience. I mean, Germany is going through this big strategic cultural change at the moment, and probably beginning to understand just how difficult this can be. And Finland and Sweden will also have to go through some fairly substantial strategic cultural changes. And the benefits that I talked about earlier will only be partly realised if Finland and Sweden are not able to make those changes that are really necessary. So for Sweden, this means a really big shift in identity from decades or centuries of neutrality, and what neutrality means for your place in the world. For Finland, it's much more about a tradition of reliance on self for defence, and that has to move to collective defence posture. And those things, will take time, and I think they'll be quite difficult to achieve. But at the political level, in concrete terms, I hope it means that we're going to see Finland and Sweden ready to speak up for NATO, to be allies, and to take positions inside the alliance that are positions that will help the Nordic-Baltic kind of cause. At the operational level, it means doing what NATO commanders, or at least thinking seriously about what NATO commanders are asking for. So at Vilnius, NATO leaders endorsed a new set of regional plans, which will put demands on all of the allies. And in our region, that will include things like host nation support for deployments. It will include perhaps things like pre-positioning, more permanent basing arrangements, maybe, being ready to deploy forces to other parts of the alliance. And I've followed the issue fairly closely in recent months, and I'm not sure quite where Finland and Sweden stand on these particular issues. I hear kind of mixed messages from this this subject. And at the tactical level, I hope we'll see Finland and Sweden making the use of those very capable armed forces for defence of the alliance, and not just for national defence. So Iro just mentioned Baltic air policing. I think that's an important contribution that Finland and Sweden can make. Also, I would add that the new Baltic air defence rotations, and I hope that Finland and Sweden will also look for cooperation opportunities with the Baltic allies. So yeah, so just to kind of summarise, I think it's important that Finland and Sweden sort of embrace their new status, and they become as good allies as they have been good partners over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Dobber, there are 2 new member states now, and but they are adding a 1,340-kilometer border to Russia. Is that a burden or an asset to NATO?
Thank you for the question. I think it is, in a way, it is both to some extent, but burden I see more as an additional responsibility rather than a real burden. And I think it's much more of an asset rather than that additional responsibility or burden that has to be taken. Maybe shortly on the border. So indeed, before Finland's accession, the border was a bit more than 1,000 kilometers, with about 400 kilometers with Kaliningrad, 150 kilometers with Norway, and the rest in the Baltics. So that border with Russia, that NATO border with Russia, has now doubled. And in addition, there's a lot of coastline in areas close to Russia that has been added as well. That's where Sweden comes into play. So there are now several hotspots in the Baltic Sea, such as Gotland and the Åland Islands, that are now part of NATO members too. I think that could be seen as a burden, because that means that from a NATO point of view, members have to take an additional responsibility. NATO has to build up capabilities to respond to threats along that border and the coastline. But both countries already have the capabilities to do so. The NATO membership in a way is in that sense is more of an insurance policy than a really concrete burden at this point for NATO. And as I said, I think it's much more of an asset rather than a burden, because having Finland and Sweden as members will increase security in the Baltic Sea and in the High North. The Baltic Sea will no longer be able to be used as a free passage to the Atlantic, and will become kind of internal NATO sea. Also because of having that experience with the border and that coastline, Sweden and Finland will be able to share experience and capabilities that can also help out other NATO members in similar situations. With Sweden, I'm mainly thinking about their maritime capabilities there. Finland is more about the territorial defense and the kind of comprehensive security know-how that Finland is very well known for. And overall, they are committed partners that have proven that they can deliver that responsibility, or they can take that responsibility themselves. And as Iro said, they are security providers, not only in their region, but also outside of the region. Maybe on the land border with Russia, maybe I think it's also important to keep in mind that from a Russian point of view, this is a massive strategic headache as well. They have a lot of military assets in the north of the border area with Finland and Norway, and before those were relatively sheltered because the border with Norway is so short, and now they are completely exposed. That leaves also on the Russian side the supply lines in a very vulnerable position. in addition to the fact that also the maritime supply lines are exposed. So in the future, that will mean that Russia has to dedicate capacity and attention to this as well. And Tony just mentioned that it will be a much more strategic or complex strategic calculation. This I completely agree with, and I think because of that additional complexity, having that border will be another deterrence from attacking any other NATO country. So again, also in that way, I think it's an added value. So in short, it is more responsibilities for the alliance, but it's also two countries that have entered, or that one has entered, one will hopefully soon enter, that are at the moment able to take care of that responsibility themselves. And having them as members will strengthen NATO's capabilities and deterrence as a whole.
Thank you very much. Let me follow up with a question about this long border there. Do you think it would be necessary to install a multinational NATO force like the EFP force in Lithuania, in Finland? Would that be a good way to, first of all, deter, and secondly, to burden share?
Can I start on that? Is that okay?
Please go ahead.
As far as I perceive it currently, I don't see any talk about that in Finland. And I think, like Jeroen just said, I mean, we have, and also, Patrick, that we have very capable defense forces. So we don't really need reinforcements, EFP forces at the moment. And even if we did, I mean, would NATO have the necessary assets and capabilities to transfer here? I mean, I think the greatest demand is currently where it is now in the Baltic countries, and Finland is more likely to be a contributor to that. However, it's an insurance policy, so it doesn't mean that in the future, hopefully never, but it doesn't mean that at some point we couldn't have reinforcements if the situation came to that. And obviously Finland, in that case, highly unlikely, but still a scenario that could exist, would be welcoming NATO troops on the ground. But I think as for permanent installments or permanent NATO troops on the ground currently, I don't see that there's any necessity or even any talk in Finland currently around that issue. There's a different issue which relates to the command structure, but that's a whole different question. So I'm not going to go and dig into that yet.
Thank you very much. I thought in terms of, risk sharing, it might be a good idea to have NATO forces, international forces, on that long border for Finland. Konrad Adenauer, the first German chancellor, and back in the 1950s, said that the first soldier who died in a hypothetical war with Russia must be an American soldier, so that America would be involved. Now, looking at it from that perspective, would a small contingent not be kind of a risk sharing and, as you said, an insurance policy for Finland?
You're asking me to respond? Yeah. Well, the thing is, I think what we're doing currently is that Finland is in the process of negotiating DCA agreement with the Americans. So the idea is such that, in case we need any help, there wouldn't be any obstacles to deploy forces in Finland. And I guess, with the current assets and capabilities, that could be done fairly quickly. I mean, there's a different aspect as well, which is, exercises and rather than having a permanent presence on the ground. So I just think, that it is unrealistic to assume as well at this point, and even whether NATO will have such EFP groups in the, within its force model in the future. I think EFP is something that was developed back in 2017 for those current needs and demands. And now what we're already seeing is hopefully scaling up of, forces in the Baltic countries. So what Finland can, I think, readily kind of assume to have is if it's necessary, temporary reinforcements on the ground. And I mean, if the situation ever came to that, I think we have a fairly strong, I would say, very strong transatlantic link currently. We had the President Joe Biden visiting us last week here in Helsinki. And I mean, the message was very clear. The Americans will, come and help and defend every inch and corner of the alliance, including Finland. So I think rather than conversing about permanent presence, I would really maybe consider more temporary enabling capabilities on the ground.
So Tony, we not only have a new member, Finland, who is very capable in military terms and who adds to our security, but is also very self-confident. What do you make out of this?
Yeah, this comes back to the idea of strategic culture that I was talking about in my my introductory remarks. I mean, Finland has, for very good reasons, been self-reliant in defence for decades and is somewhat reluctant to give that up now. Finnish leaders take the opportunity to stress when they talk about NATO that nothing's going to change when we join NATO. We'll still have the same kind of defence systems. And I think Iro is probably right that because there's such a little appetite for having a permanent presence on the ground, it's probably not going to happen. But at the same time, I think we have to remember that NATO is a political alliance as well as a military alliance. In fact, maybe even more so a political alliance. And the way we signal our commitment to each other, it involves things like presence in each other's territory, and those things are important. They're important for deterrence, and they're important for maintaining cohesion in the alliance. So I hope that that as time goes on, Finland will be persuaded to at least have some kind of presence of the alliance. I mean, maybe it's a NATO force integration unit to start with, but maybe it's something a little bit more substantial as time moves on.
Jeroen, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I agree with both, and I think in the end it depends on Finland's threat assessment and political deliberation. I think that's in the end what is most important. I wanted to add something about what Iro said, that there should be no obstacles about having NATO forces in Finland. I think maybe that should be the most important focus at this point, to make sure that if a situation were to arise where NATO troops in Finland are necessary, and that it's possible to get them there as soon as possible, and to already prepare infrastructure for that, and to make sure that in terms of military mobility, that the transport is as easy as possible. So to make sure that in case something happens, that everything is set, and that can happen very quickly. And again, going back to the topic of deterrence, I think that will offer another element of deterrence towards Russia.
Thank you very much. Let me come to a different topic, the one about political cultures, different political cultures in the Baltic and in the Scandinavian states. Mina Arlander, who you probably all know, just recently wrote, "Finland did not take a holiday from history like other countries did." Why so? Explain, the Finnish experience in terms of deterrence.
I guess that's a question for me again to start with. I agree with Minna. I mean, obviously, all countries come from different positions and perspectives, and I think maybe none of the countries really took a holiday from history. They just highlighted different aspects, or they kind of put some aspects behind. But I think in Finland there's such a strong, collective memory of the events of the Second World War. And, it's really passed on from generation to generation. Also taught through the history books at school, how we had to fight as a small country. I mean, we have a big geographical area, surface to cover, but we are literally a little bit more than 5 million people. And what it really meant for us. And I think that was really never forgotten even though the Finns kind of maybe tuned it down a bit also for years, I mean, independence and peace is very important for us, but it's also very quickly can be kind of taken for granted. And I think what really happened a year ago when Russia brutally invaded Ukraine was that collective memory was kind of reactivated in our historical DNA. And many Finns felt that at that point that, what the Ukrainians are living through or were living through a year ago is something that we experienced in Finland, through the Winter War and the events of the Second World War. But yeah, I think I agree with the fact that, we never kind of forgot that in terms of our military planning, for instance. Finland has been preparing, for a major, military conflict, also after the events of the Cold War and, during the post-Cold War period. And it's basically explained by the fact that we share a long border, with our next door neighbor, Russia, that can be very unpredictable, like what we saw in Georgia in 2008, and then after, the events of the first war in Ukraine, that things can change very quickly. And luckily, I mean, there's been always this long-term perspective in the Finnish mindset, both political mindset and the military mindset, that we cannot turn a blind eye on our next door neighbor. And even though we tried to maintain the good relations, and we did during the post-Cold War period, I mean, things can really change and, in one night. So, yeah, I have to say, I agree with this analysis.
Great, thank you very much for these elaborations and this view into the historical experience of Finland, which was obviously very different from the German experience, for example. Still, I'll have to ask and come back to the 1,340-kilometer border, kind of. The Baltic Sea is now largely a NATO room, so to speak, physical room. But can Russia still be a meaningful, meaning dangerous actor within the Baltic Sea? Has that danger been completely banned, or how do you rate that? Tony?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, the short answer is yes, it still can be a danger. We have this kind of term, the NATO lake, that's being thrown around quite a lot at the moment. It's a sort of an echo of the old, I think, German term, Red Lake, for describing the Baltic Sea during the Cold War. And it's a term that's not necessarily supposed to be taken very seriously. It's a bit journalistic, maybe, but and it geographically reflects a certain truth. I mean, there's only this sort of small area around St. Petersburg and Kaliningrad, which are now Russian shorelines on the Baltic Sea. But I think, if we start talking about the NATO lake, we risk complacency and we forget the dangers that are still there. The Russian Baltic Fleet is still the largest national fleet in the Baltic Sea, and depending on what you're counting, there's something like 40 or 50 warships there. Some of them quite carefully tailored for Baltic Sea operations, so confined and shallow water operations. Russia is enormously dependent on the Baltic as a trade route. Before the war, before the sanctions, something like 50% or more than 50% of Russia's container traffic traveled through the Baltic Sea to those ports in the St. Petersburg area. So it's not going to simply, walk away and give all that up. And in terms of, once the war ends, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen and what the outcome will be, but I think a fairly likely scenario is that we'll have an embittered Russia that still wants to needle the West and attack the West, and the way it can do that is through hybrid operations. And the Baltic Sea is a very good place for doing kind of hybrid attacks and hybrid warfare. So, obviously it's good for us that we have much more sort of control over the Baltic Sea, that we're able to use our navies together to deny Russia what it might want, but we can't afford to be complacent. And in that sense, we shouldn't perhaps be talking about a NATO lake quite yet.
Jeroen, what is your take on the Baltic Sea now?
I had a very similar point to make. It was mainly about also the fact that it will be much more difficult for Russian vessels to sail the Baltic Sea undetected. There will also be more information sharing probably, but the threat is that doesn't diminish the threat so much. And I agree with Tony that in terms of the potential for hybrid operations, this is it's very likely that things will happen there. So that's something to look out for.
So we've looked at the Baltic Sea. We've looked at the Finnish land border to Russia. Now let's take a look at organizational agreements. Finland will be joining the Joint Forces Command in Brunssum in the Netherlands. Does this make sense to you, Iro, or shouldn't they rather be at Norfolk because Scandinavia is part of the Norfolk lineup? What do you think?
It does make sense and it doesn't make sense, but let me elaborate. First of all, I think this is not fixed, as we know. I mean, the NATO command structure is still in vivo, meaning that we're likely to see maybe some changes to it. I mean, we just approved those new defense plans and the DDA concept in Vilnius. And based on those plans that are now going to be put into practice, as well as the necessary requirements for the capability development, there might be changes to the command and control structure. And obviously the Nordic countries, like in many things, they would like to stick together, depending on the question, obviously. Now, since Finland has a very strong land-focused defense forces, it does make more sense maybe to be with Brunssum, because it's more land operations-focused command. However, in the future, and when the Norfolk command maybe achieves its full potential, because it just has achieved its full operational capability, to my understanding, years ago. I mean, it's just been established, really. There is a better chance that it could accommodate, and maybe Finland and Sweden could bring in this, extra asset to provide it more tangible support as well. But my point is basically this. I mean, it goes like General Cavalier says, it all goes back to the plans. So if we have those 3 regionally focused plans, one for the Atlantic and Northern Europe, then we have Baltic countries and Central Europe and the Southern Mediterranean region, then it would make totally more sense, for the Nordic countries to go with the kind of Northern group and Norfolk. However, even in this, you could have some flexible arrangements. When you consider the Baltic region, I think the Finnish naval forces would have more to contribute for the defense of the Baltic Sea, as well as the Swedish ones. So one could even think of dividing, different services into different types of plans and commands. So in conclusion, I would like to say, I think this is still much in process. And I think, generally speaking, obviously, now as we see a tightening up of the transatlantic link with all the Nordic countries, it would make more sense if we maintain the Norfolk for Finland to be in the north, in the northern hemisphere. And also we could provide a lot more for the Arctic defense as well. We have capable troops that, could provide support and capability-wise for those plans. But then the Baltic Sea region, I think the maritime components would be more interoperable and could support more the maritime region in the Baltic Sea area. So I kind of give you, an answer which really, it's either or. I think it would be kind of both.
That's a Solomonic answer to that question, but we still don't know. This is an organizational question that has to be worked out over time, certainly. I looked at the high degree of integration within the Scandinavian, the Nordic states. And I thought this kind of looks like a Nordic NATO within NATO. Where do you see the pros and cons of this kind of strong Scandinavian cohesiveness?
I think there are more pros than cons. And what I mean by this, that even though I think NATO will have to kind of come in terms with the fact that there is certain regionalization of capabilities within the alliance. And this is, we all look at different directions. It doesn't mean that we would be forming permanent blocks. I think some NATO countries might be, allied countries, worried about that if the Nordic countries become too strong, that they kind of alienate themselves from the rest and start to do their own business up in the north with the Americans, and they don't see the good of the whole alliance anymore. I don't think that is a worry. I think what really could be done is that, and also is being done already now, is that if the Nordic countries, they operate together in many ways. For instance, the air forces, they exercise together, they could pool and share resources and assets in a more efficient manner. And then obviously the beneficiaries of that would be all the other NATO countries and allies as well. For instance, the Baltic countries. So I really don't see it as a threat. I see it as an opportunity, but I go back to Tony's point, and that tangles with the fact that we are not doing this alone anymore. We are, as the Finns, we are doing it together. And I think there Finland still has a lot to learn to kind of understand that, what it really means to defend the alliance as a whole. But that's a different question again, so maybe we'll come back to that.
That's a question of strategic culture and a changing and shifting strategic culture. Tony, you just raised your hand.
Yeah, maybe just to add a couple of points. I mean, first of all, on the command structure, the Brunssum Norfolk thing. I mean, certainly from a Baltic perspective, it's pretty clear that Finland and Sweden should be with Brunssum rather than Norfolk. And I guess that's largely because, in the Baltic region, Baltic leaders see the prospect of a conflict in the Baltic region as a much more kind of serious thing than a prospect of a conflict in the Arctic, even though we all recognise that's an area of growing risk and threat. And they see that the region should be indivisible in terms of its defence. So land, sea, and air all need to be looked at together from the same command arrangements. But as Iro says, I mean, this is not fixed. NATO has to have some kind of command structure review. And I was quite surprised to see from Vilnius that, I mean, the command structure was mentioned and it was talked about as being amended, but there was no sort of tasking to do a proper review of it. I mean, command structure review is a very political thing and a difficult thing to get through. But the command structure we have at the moment is basically designed for expeditionary operations and not for collective defence. So that needs to be reviewed. But ultimately, I mean, for manageability and organisational reasons, you have to draw lines somewhere, and somebody's always going to be less satisfied than others. In terms of regionalisation, I mean, I think it's inevitable in a NATO of 32 that there'll be some kind of regionalisation. It's also partly undesirable because NATO's kind of leading strength is its unity and its cohesion, and if all 32 allies aren't committed to a certain cause, then that's not necessarily a good thing. I see the risk here as being that other allies will look at the region and look at how competent the Nordic region is and kind of think that, well, it's a done deal. We don't need to worry about this anymore. Let them get on with it. They're quite capable. And that's clearly not the case. I mean, we clearly need other allies engaged in the region. Americans, certainly, but also big European allies, the Germans, the Brits, the French. We need to have them all in the region. Otherwise, our defence and deterrence is somewhat limited.
Can I ask all three of you? We are in Germany. We are in front of a German audience. What do you expect from Germany around this whole accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. What do you expect from us as allies? Let's start with Iro.
Okay, a difficult question. I was thinking, wow, no, this is a difficult question because I always want to keep my feet on the ground, and I think this is a very Finnish way of doing it. You know, we are very kind of pragmatic and realistic. So, and I'm not an expert on German foreign and security policy, so I hope my expectations are not too far-fetched, whatever I say from now. But I think it ties up with the mentality, and I think whatever you provide, the Finns always would like to see sustainable and tangible solutions. And I'm not going to name any specific capabilities, although I have to say that definitely a strong maritime presence is something that will be probably highly valued in the Baltic Sea region. You know, but still, I think, you know, maybe providing, you know, a closer support for the regional allies and partners as well. And I'm more looking into the Baltic direction in that sense, you know, thinking maybe there is something that could be, you know, further reinforced on that front. But I wouldn't say, and I also think probably, and this goes beyond the NATO, what NATO does in terms of for its own, you know, allies and partners. But I'm really looking to Ukraine, and I think the Finnish and I would say probably all the other Nordic countries, they strongly support Ukraine. And I think what we really would like to see is courage in taking those important decisions to support Ukraine to its membership.
We have a question from the audience from Karl-Heinz Fritz Möller relating to Ukraine. He asks, why is no one in NATO thinking about actively helping Ukraine with their own soldiers? It doesn't have to and shouldn't happen at the front line, but you could help Ukraine to secure air defenses for the civilian population, protect all the big cities, and thereby give the Ukrainian military the opportunity to use their existing air defenses at the front to use. Now, why is that the case? Jeroen, it's a question for you, I guess.
Yeah, I think I think the most important reason for that is that most NATO allies think that would further escalate the conflict, and that would make it a conflict between NATO and Russia. That means that NATO would get actively involved in that, which most NATO member countries don't want to start. And as far as I know, but I don't know if the other speakers know more about that. But as far as I know, NATO is formally neutral in this conflict. It is not a player. It is not a part in any of it. Of course, NATO countries are supporting Ukraine very much. Also during NATO meetings, it is discussed extensively. But it's not NATO as such. Is not on the ground.
Mm. What do you think? Let's come to something pragmatic but essential. That is the defense industries in Finland and in Sweden. To what extent do they add to our strategic capabilities? Jeroen, you seem to agree on that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think there especially maybe Iro can tell a bit more about the Finnish defense industry, but I think this is one of the big assets that both Sweden and Finland add to NATO, which is something that now is more important than ever, actually, because there are big shortages in almost all armed forces in the NATO countries. Sweden has a lot of production capacity. They have so their defense industry produces submarines, fighter jets, armored vehicles, artillery systems, rockets, and ammunition. They've provided a lot of that also to Ukraine now. They're exporting that also to other NATO countries. So they have a very strong, traditionally also a very strong defense industry, which can help NATO to kind of replenish the stocks and develop new technology.
May I just add, I think that you've really highlighted very well the main points, and I think the difference between Finland and Sweden really is, well, in terms of capabilities as well, but in the scale. I mean, Sweden is so much bigger than Finland, and I mean, what really kind of hit me as well, that is actually the third largest weapons exporter per capita, globally speaking, and I mean, that is quite something. For Finland, I mean, armored wheeled vehicles, logistics, command and control systems could be, for instance, those that Finland could really provide. So I think it really boils down to two aspects: is how we can better support Ukraine, like Jeroen just said, you know. But the second thing also is that what kind of needs there are in terms of NATO's defense planning, and how the national industries could fill in those gaps as well. But obviously, there's always the question of, of the challenge of national protectionism in terms of defense industry and the security of supply in each country. And I think what the European defense industries should really now realize and overcome is kind of the fact that, you know, we really need to provide what is needed and required, and you know, sort out the equation, because otherwise there will be not enough capabilities on the ground, to be used.
You're muted, Marcus.
Excuse me, sorry. That's obviously a big problem in Europe. We have like a lot more defense systems around in Europe than the Americans have in numbers, but our punch doesn't seem to match this situation, I guess. So there needs to be a lot more cooperation in military terms. That is not only true for the Nordic countries, but that's for all of Europe, I guess. Iro, you raised that question about Ukrainian membership to NATO, which, and I'm asking all three of you this, which in your eyes would be necessary, reasonable conditions that have to be met before Ukraine can become a member state. I'll start with you, Jeroen.
I still have my hand up for the other question, but I'll try to answer this one. I think
we'll come back to that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. I'm not because it's a political question, I think, and there can be, the conditions can be fulfilled at some point, but then still it's a political question. So I think politically, as far as the war is still ongoing, it will be very difficult membership. And so I think the most important condition would be that the war ends. I think, and then apart from that, there are many different political calculations, but it's a more a political question than a military question, I think.
Tony, what do you think? What is reasonable?
Sure. I mean, again,
what is realistic?
It is a difficult question, and as Jeroen rightly points out, it's a political question. I mean, the Allies could politically decide to let Ukraine in any time they wanted, but the appetite is just not there at the moment. Certainly, the war has to end. I mean, there is zero appetite in the alliance for admitting a nation that's fighting off an aggression. But I think we don't know how the war is going to end, but different outcomes will have different implications for Ukraine's future membership. Admitting a Ukraine that's territorially complete within its 1991 borders is a very different question from admitting a Ukraine that's partly occupied by Russia or some kind of frozen conflict situation. So I think, Ukraine was obviously disappointed by the outcome of the Vilnius summit, as were its supporters. But I think NATO probably did the best it could in terms of continuing to offer as much practical support as it can do, for as long as Ukraine needs it. And this is a step that we have to consider a bit later on down the line.
Yeah, you seem to echo my op-ed piece on the summit. Iro, what do you think? What are your...
Yeah, I agree with Tony and Jeroen as well. I mean, the war needs to end. There's no membership invitation before the war has ended. And it is obviously disappointing for Ukraine, but I think in Vilnius, there were good things that came out as well. The NATO-Ukraine Council. Another thing then is, of course, how do we monitor, how ready Ukraine is for the membership? And taking out the membership action plan, which is the program to kind of orienteer the candidate state for the membership. Well, that was kind of a framework or a structure. And what I'm a little bit worried now is that, we know how difficult it was already for Finland and Sweden towards the end of the alliance. Will there be countries saying, well, actually, Ukraine doesn't fulfill the criteria in terms of good governance? Or will there be, some countries saying that, they still need to improve military interoperability? So I think it would really help if some concrete criteria was written down or laid out, because Ukraine needs to fulfill certain criteria and it's on its way there. And the military interoperability question is one, but then obviously there are political and judicial requirements as well. Questions of good governance that needs to be met and this criteria fulfilled, that Ukraine is ready for the membership. But I think what is really important is the unified message from Vilnius that Ukraine will become a NATO member once this criteria is fulfilled. And I think that is really important because, there are different views in terms of different countries, but now we have a clear message that's been sent out.
I will make a last round now. Last question to each of you. The accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO certainly came in an unwarranted situation that not many of us could foresee. Now, looking at it, the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO, is that a win-win situation both for Finland and Sweden and for NATO? Go ahead, Jeroen.
Yes, I think absolutely a win-win. I think the way we discussed it now, it increases the security in the Baltics, in the high north. It adds new capabilities to the alliance, capabilities that the alliance is not so strong in at the moment. It will change the calculus for Russia, so it will add, as Tony said, more strategic complexity. And I think so Sweden and Finland were already as integrated as countries can be. So now they have a seat at the table and they can contribute to NATO decision making. And maybe drawing on the last question that you just asked, I think perhaps that's also that might be interesting for Ukraine to look at that the case of Finland and Sweden as well, how one can integrate so closely, because there's a lot of added value in those stages before actual membership already. And then when the political appetite is there, maybe one day, one day Ukraine will enter as well.
Jeroen, yeah, our time is running out.
Okay,
let's have Iro, who started this conversation, the final word on it. Is it a win-win?
Absolutely, it's a triple win for Finland, Sweden, and the alliance. I will not elaborate anymore. I think Jeroen really wrapped it up really well. So absolutely, yes.
And Tony?
Yeah, unquestionably. And I would stress, the political aspects more than anything. We're probably heading for a period of high tension, and the more of us that stand together against potential aggression, the better we all are.
Thank you very much, all three of you. It's been a great discussion. Thank you very much to Iro Särkkä, Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Tony Lawrence, International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn, Estonia, and Jeroen Dobber, head of the Global Security Hub at Friedrich-Naumann Foundation in Brussels. Thank you all, and I hope all our viewers and listeners had a good and informative